Before we start today, I just want to acknowledge with respect the Indigenous peoples and communities whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day and on whose traditional territories our work takes place. My name is Autumn Sipus. I am the Marketing and Outreach Coordinator with the Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare, and on behalf of the Coalition and CASCADES, who is funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. Where is the money? Investment and divestment considerations for healthcare workers, associations, and foundations. Throughout the webinar, please use the chat function for any technical issues you may be experiencing. Use the Q&A function for any questions you have regarding the presentation, and our panelists will be answering all questions at the end of our webinar today. We will also be recording this webinar, which will be sent to all of our registrants and will be available on our website/YouTube channel at a later date. To start off the webinar today, I would like to invite Dr. Miles Sargent, Executive Director of the Coalition and Partnerships Lead with Peach Health Ontario, to introduce today's topic and speakers. Take it away, Miles.
Thank you, Autumn, and welcome everybody. Kate, if you don't mind sharing the first set of slides. So today we will be talking about investments, divestments, impact investing, and what this all means and how it's related to healthcare. I will be the moderator. I'm just doing a quick introduction here. Fossil fuels 101, if you will. These are CO2 emissions by fuel type over the past 150 years, and you can see how the CO2 emissions have risen. We're now up around 35 billion tons CO2 emissions by fossil fuels per year, and you can see at the 2021 mark that things stalled a bit because of COVID. But nonetheless, coal is still on the bottom there, still a big factor. Oil in the middle, gas in purple. So this is a major contributor to climate change. Next slide, please. So those different gases we were just looking at, fuel types, are seen here in terms of carbon dioxide. So that what I showed in the first one is basically carbon dioxide in blue, 65%. So just to show you how it mixes in with all the other greenhouse gases, so methane there in terms of agriculture and food waste, nitrous oxide on there, but obviously carbon dioxide from fossil fuels is the big one. Next slide. And the impact of fossil fuels, health impact, air pollution as a result of burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, again, drive climate change and are estimated to cause 13 deaths per minute worldwide as per the World Health Organization, and also a huge contributor to air pollution in Canada, estimated 15,000 premature deaths per year, clearly impacting asthma sufferers and causing other acute respiratory symptoms. So I will now hand it over to Adam, Adam Scott is going to be our first panelist. He is the executive director of SHIFT, and the SHIFT team works with wide-ranging stakeholders to bring international climate leadership into Canada's financial sector. Adam is a climate change expert with extensive domestic and international experience in policy, energy, and finance. Previously, Adam was Senior Advisor to Oil Change International and Manager of Environmental Defence Canada's Climate and Energy Program. And Adam will be giving us an introduction to basic concepts outlining relationships between finance and the health sector. Adam.
Thank you, Miles. Yeah, that's a great introduction and a good start for the conversation. I'm going to try to be very quick. And I'm also speaking here from the treaty lands and territory of Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territories of the Chippewa and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples. Yeah, and a quick overview of SHIFT there. We are a small charitable project focused on shifting Canada's financial sector, and we do that by building power within the memberships of pension plans. So, almost all Canadians are a member of a pension plan, and they have a lot of power to have influence over large financial institutions. So we help them exercise that power. So yeah, I'm going to give a quick overview of why the financial system is a critical lever for climate action. We'll just keep going through those slides, Laura, onto the next one, or one more. We'll skip ahead because Miles covered this. Yeah, this is a slide of sort of the implications of all of that greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We've seen this year that red line on the top there is where we are in terms of warming. So we're living in the midst of a global climate crisis. This isn't something that's happening in the future. We are experiencing it right now. And you can see that red line is so much further above the averages of previous years. We're really getting into uncharted territory now. The climate scientists this year, quote from a couple of weeks ago from a leading climate scientist, described this as gobsmackingly bananas, shocking, extraordinary, and a struggle to understand at this scale. And this is a process that's accelerating this warming. So it's having global implications. And we'll talk more about the health implications, but I think a lot of them are quite evident to folks on this call. I think you're aware well of the health impacts. But I wanted to, next slide, please, Laura. I wanted to show this slide sort of at the outset to show this is what we need to do to get out of this crisis. This is a slide that shows the black line is historical emissions to date, and the colored pathways down are various pathways for reaching our 1.5 degree goal. Trying to limit the average surface temperature increase below 1.5 is about limiting the worst potential impacts of this crisis. And in order to do it, we're now facing an unbelievably quick decline. Had we started earlier, we would have had a smoother time of this, but this is where we are. And I want you to just take away from this graph that, you know, this is this is an unprecedented transition away from fossil fuels that is required. This isn't about gently reducing emissions. This is about finding rapid pathways to zero and ending our fossil fuel dependence as quickly as possible. And it's such a substantial shift that this won't just come from government policy. We need a substantial shift in where capital that flows throughout our economy is invested. And that means we have to immediately stop investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure and shift that capital into investments in real climate solutions, carbon-free investments that accelerate our ability to move down this curve quickly. So I just wanted to show that for context. That's where we're going. So the financial sector itself provides insurance, debt, capital to every sector of the economy. It's the decisions of financial institutions behind boardroom doors and corporations have a huge impact on whether or not we continue to build fossil fuel related infrastructure and continue our dependence, or if we're going to be able to scale up existing proven technologies to move away from fossil fuels that will also clean up our air and lead to a safer, more affordable, cleaner future. So financial institutions luckily are starting to get this. They're starting to understand that the climate crisis presents an existential threat to the financial system itself, and are starting to recognize that it's in their own best interest to align financial flows with climate safety. But most of them don't just get how serious and rapid this shift needs to be. So we're in sort of an incrementalist mode at the moment, and that has to change. So it's really not about slowing down or slowly winding down investment in fossil fuels. It has to end right away. And we're talking about the health sector today because this health sector is hugely influential in this. The various institutions involved in health are incredibly powerful. Health charities, pension funds, all sorts of different sectors involved with the health sector have a lot of influence over the financial system this way. So I wanted to quickly flag that the World Health Organization and over 300 other health organizations around the world have signed on to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which you can learn more about at that link. You'll see fossilfueltreaty.org, which is about rapidly ending investment in fossil fuel exploration, extraction, and infrastructure. So we can talk about that more later, but just wanted to flag that a lot of health entities around the world have been leading on this conversation. On to slide 7 there, please, Laura. Yeah. So a couple of different ways in which individuals can have impact and shift finance, and personal investments. So how you invest your own retirement savings can have a huge impact at a systemic level. The various associations and memberships and affiliations that you have across your professional and personal life can be hugely significant. Medical associations, the Registered Nurses Association, we can talk about those, all have a lot of influence. And then, of course, the large institutional investments that you're a part of. So the healthcare pensions, various foundations, health charities, all of those other levels have a huge decision-making ability. So you have influence over all 3 of those categories. And we'd like to help you take action to actually pull that lever. And that's what we can do at Shift. And my colleague Laura will talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, but I'll pass it over to Colin.
Actually, I will take it from here, but thank you very much, Adam. We hear you loud and clear. Our next panelist, Colin Suchu Lam, is a senior surgical resident, holds a PhD in clinical epidemiology. He is a member of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, better known as CAPE, and has participated, he has participated in numerous fossil fuel divestment campaigns. He is interested in the history and politics of the environment, health, and healthcare. And today he will talk about divestment, how and why does it work, and he will also speak about theories of change. Colin.
Thanks for the wonderful introduction. I'm also coming to you from the Dish from One Spoon territory, and I thank Cascades and the Coalition for Green Healthcare for the opportunity to share my perspective and experience with divestment. So we can skip through disclosures, of which I have none. We understand now that fossil fuel combustion is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing climate change, and there needs to be a rapid, intentional wind down in fossil fuel production to be consistent with a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. Unfortunately, across the board, these fossil majors over the next 10 years are planning on expanding production. This is not necessarily or really in line with this interest in staying on the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. You might look at that and say, well, that's not really a big deal. It doesn't matter what these fossil fuel firms are planning on doing, because there is an irreversible momentum behind clean energy at this point in time, like Barack says in Science magazine in 2017. The price of electricity from clean energy, from wind and solar, is simply so low that it's uneconomic to do anything else. And not only is renewable clean, it's also cheap and safe. So why would anybody do anything else? We're going to see essentially a displacement of the bad stuff, the bad expensive stuff, by the clean and cheap stuff. So it doesn't really matter what these fossil fuel firms think. The future is going to leave them behind thanks to economics of supply and demand. And so in this narrative, confronting these fossil majors in any sort of political way takes a backseat to making sure that we're just pouring money into building the green economy of the future, making renewables cheaper and cheaper so they displace fossil fuels. But I think that there's another perspective here that we can take from history. And to tell that story, I want to talk about whaling in the 1800s. This is a cartoon published by Vanity Fair in 1861, showing a grand ball being hosted by whales, honoring the discovery of petroleum in Pennsylvania. And they're partying because just as we expect non-fossil energy to displace fossil energy, these whales are expecting petroleum to displace whale oil. And unfortunately for these partying whales, the dawn of the fossil fuel age heralded an unprecedented acceleration in the extinction of whale populations around the world. More whales than ever were killed during an era of plentiful alternatives to whale products. And so I think this brief, cute little story, not cute, it's horrific, but it's short. This history illustrates the limitations of technological fixes absent corresponding economic and political changes with respect to solving environmental problems. And it's this economic and political aspect of change that I think is most important to consider as we come together to talk about where is the money. So first, in addition to talking about where is the money, I think it's important to talk about what is money. So the IMF would tell you that it's a store of value, it's a medium of exchange, the unit of account. But what does money do in real life, like in our day-to-day lives? Patel and Moore say that money facilitates and compels action at a distance. And that involves relationships of power. If you are compelled to do something, you are made to do it. And we know that because when we go to the grocery store, we cash out, someone is made to complete a transaction to us, to give us a banana that Dominican producers were compelled to produce for export to Canada. And this sort of power relationship exists in a web of other relationships. So that makes money an ecological relation, just like a bird, a stream, a human being is an ecological relation to all of the other ecological relations around it. And this has long been the case. This is a quote from an early ecologist talking about the late 15th century silver boom in Central Europe that produced modernity's first great worker peasant revolt. And he says that the woods and groves are cut down for those need of an endless amount of wood for timbers, machines, and the smelting of metals. And when the woods and groves are felled and are exterminated the beasts and birds, when the ores are washed, the water which has been used poisons the brooks and the streams, and either destroys the fish or drives them away. And we need only to look to the immense carbon footprint of Bitcoin mining to see that the dematerialization of money doesn't imply that it's any less of a real thing than the days of silver. And to come closer to home, we can think about the ecological relations and the compulsions involved in, for example, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which implicates and integrates the millions of individuals in Alberta and South Korea who are pensioners in the ecologies of the Wet'suwet'en, their waters, their salmon, their trees, their land. And so I'm trying to illustrate that the boundaries between economics, politics, and ecology are a lot more porous than we really give them credit for, or are encouraged to take credit for, to give them credit for. This is a quote from a political economist, Ellen Meaksons-Wood, who says that our current political economy, capitalism, has driven a wedge between the economic and the political, where essentially political issues like the disposition of powers to control production and appropriation, or the allocation of our labor and resources have been cut off from the political arena and displaced to a separate economic sphere governed by economic laws of supply and demand and imperatives that are outside of political decision-making. In other words, instead of decisions being made by affected parties to allocate resources in some kind of explicitly political fashion, private entities are free to deploy their resources to allocate everybody's labor and resources in ways that meet the economic imperatives to profit or increase share prices, as opposed to the perhaps social imperative to maintain a stable climate. Decisions to close or open a factory are not generally made on the basis of an explicit political demand to do so, but instead on the exigencies of market competition. So how divestment works then, first, divestment is just the removal of funds from things that we don't believe ought to be a part of our future. Very simple. And now that we understand these sort of porous boundaries between the economic, political, and ecologic, I think we best understand divestment as a tool for repoliticizing the economic and revealing ecological relations that have always been there, but that are hard to see in the day-to-day. Divestment works by attacking social license and by recognizing that the economic is political and that we ought to have a say in what we do with our shared societal resources and not leave it up to the sort of abstract laws of economics. Social license is defined by this trade press as a community's perceptions of the acceptability of the company and its local operations. And they recognize that failure to gain social license can lead to conflicts, delays, added costs, or even prohibition of projects, which, given the graph that Adam showed earlier, sounds like a good idea. So now that the theory is behind us, let's say you're convinced that divestment is a good idea. How do you actually campaign? What did I do? So, before 2018, I had no knowledge of any of this. But I think that like most healthcare workers, I was like most healthcare workers, and then I didn't have knowledge. But I think it's very easy to go from there to taking action. You don't need to be, an expert. You don't need to be an economist. You don't need to be a board member necessarily to have a say on this. Lots of institutions have divested, but only 23 of these have been health institutions. And I think that's a great sort of way to show that there's lots of room to grow for health. In terms of resources to reach for, yes, there's shift. and they're fantastic. There's also 350.org, who has lovely training resources online for how to build a campaign, how to make decisions as a group, which is something we don't often actually have to do that much in our day-to-day lives. There are also wonderful templates from labor organizing resources like Labor Notes. They have these campaign planning templates that are really designed for workplace organizing. But again, these are just approaches to making decisions as a group and doing things together, again, that we don't have the opportunity to do much in real life. So they'll take you through what your issue is, who your allies are, who has power to fix the problem, what tactics make sense to you and your group in the context. And you know, it's very much choose your own adventure, and anybody can get started. What did our group look like? Well, as a member of CAPE, I was part of the Ontario chapter, and we formed a divestment subgroup on the listserv. It was very low tech. We gathered over Zoom, given it was March 2020, and we were also dispersed across Ontario. We thought that we'd set our eyes on the OMA because we knew that the CMA had previously divested its foundation funds from fossil fuels. We thought that we needed to build some momentum and interest in this from allies in OMA. So we hosted webinars. We attended a speaking tour from the leadership to put this bug in everybody's ear. And when we thought we had enough support, we emailed the OMA leadership to provide them with information, to request divestment, and a meeting to discuss the same, where we presented a talk kind of like this one. In 2021, we did meet with them, and in later that year, they did announce that their goal would be to completely divest of fossil fuels and tobacco. So this is like a 1 year long from, you know, it being an idea to it happening, and this is sort of like pales in comparison to the 10-year long campaign that it took to divest U of T. But I think it just goes to show that until you try, you don't know what you're going to have to do. You might not have to do any sitting in anybody's office. You might just need to ask nicely and send an email and show up to a meeting, which is great. Why did it work? You know, I think that the OMA was not necessarily opposed to this. They just hadn't thought about it before. Like most people, the economic and the political were separate. The OMA leadership at the time was sympathetic, and there was a CMA precedent. So I think, as Adam said, you need to think about what kinds of organizations you're a part of. Individual divestment is one thing, but because I think it works best as an attack on social license, this has to occur socially. This is something that best happens when, you know, a more powerful person than, you know, myself, speaking for myself and only myself, says that this is not something I want to put my money in. So think about the organizations you're involved with, identify your allies, and just start having conversations. Ask people like what's going on at your institution. Very non-confrontational, very easy actions to take. And from there, figure out with your allies what you need to do. I think that anybody can take this action. It's a great way to sort of feel like you're doing something. And that's all I have.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin. And next, we will get Richard ready here. Richard Webster graduated with a PhD in biology from Carleton University and then worked as a bioinformatics visiting fellow at Health Canada before joining CHEO. Richard's now the co-director of the Ontario Child Health Support Unit, interim scientific director of the Clinical Research Unit at CHEO Research Institute, and the founding member of CHEO Kick the Carbon program. As a scientist, his research program focuses on strategic planning for net zero healthcare and carbon footprinting. Colin just brought up the fact that of all the different organizations, divesting healthcare was 1%. And so curious if Richard's going to touch on that. Richard is going to focus on a hospital level perspective and the types of investments, such as hospitals themselves or foundations, that we can do. Richard.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to sort of continue on Colin's theme of let's just start the conversation. I think it's hard to begin the conversation, but once it gets going, it can be really enriching. So who are we having these conversations with? Well, we can talk on lots of different levels. I think that's been clear. We can talk individually in our own minds. We can talk to our spouse about what we do with the money we have in our bank accounts. And then there's institutional investing by hospitals and foundations. And then like the bigger pots of money are these like pension funds and larger financial organizations. So I think it's worth, as a person's floating around causing trouble in my hospital, I'm concentrating on what I can do and what people I bump into in my hospital can do. So several years ago, my wife and I sat down, we had conversations about it, how it was important for us to divest our paltry savings from fossil fuels. And it was a really surprisingly hard conversation. I mean, you're talking about lots of really sensitive subjects. I'm a statistician, so I love dealing with numbers, but as soon as you put a number sign in front of especially big numbers, the heart rate start going up. So to have some of these conversations, I think it's really good to have really clear language and ways to talk to people appropriately. So one of the words that you could use is fiduciary responsibility. Maybe don't use this with your spouse. But what this is about is it's about when you invest, you're thinking about value. You're thinking about you have some money, you put it in some funds, you're hoping for there to be a certain return, and then sort of eroding those returns are the fees and taxes around that fund. And then on the flip side, we have this whole other domain, which is about risk. And we want to try and dilute our risk. We want to diversify our investment. Maybe we would achieve that through market indexing. We want to hold many, many different funds to sort of minimize our risk. And maybe we want to think about how it's distributed globally or regionally. So this already, your heart rate is going, your sort of fiduciary responsibility, oh, very scary. But then we maybe want to add another component into value. Like, what is this money being used for? Where is it being put? And that's where we come into this ESG investing, environmental, social governance, and what is the carbon intensity of some of these funds that we're putting our money in, that we've aren't to save, and that maybe have been given to the hospital foundations by well-meaning donors. And I think most importantly, how substantial, what is the magnitude that we're talking about here? Like, is it worth going through these awkward conversations on a Sunday night instead of watching Netflix? So how bad is putting your money blindly into the market for climate change? Well, the carbon intensity of the general market is approximately, I mean, these numbers are really, really, really approximate, 220 tons of carbon equivalents per $1 million sale. So to sort of convert this for you, that's $1 million that's sitting in a bank in sort of indiscriminate funds is going to have the emissions equivalent of running almost 50 cars for a year. So that's a big chunk. So then the next question is, so that's a big amount of carbon, but is there a feasible alternative? And I think what people seem to think is that you can, if you put some thought into your investments and adopt some sort of screening out of fossil fuels, you can maybe get a 70 to 80% reduction of the dirtiness of your funds. So that's a big chunk. And if you do it in the right way and you talk to the right people and use the right resources, you can achieve that hopefully with minimum change to your risk and your diversity of your funds. So let's bring it back to the sort of different decision makers. So there's yourself, maybe you have 100K in the bank account that you've been saving for years and years. That's the equivalent of, so let's say your family has one car and you're working really hard and making your life really difficult by having only one car and using public transit, but you have this 100K in the bank. That's equivalent to the emissions of buying an extra car. And then if we scale this up to sort of institutes and foundations, let's say a hospital foundation has about 300 million of long-term investments. Well, that's a sort of typical size that at least my institute roughly has in our foundation. And that's equivalent to 14, 15,000 cars being run per year. These are crazy big numbers. So we've talked about this already. Healthcare has a large carbon footprint. It's surprising how few healthcare institutes have already embarked on this divestment journey. We need to use the funds that government and donors give to us better. Also, I think it's interesting to sort of consider, yes, it's hard having these conversations about fiduciary responsibility and going down this way, but how hard is it relative to other actions? If I was to choose between talking to a financial committee about where they place their investments, relative to if I was to sit down with a team of surgeons and try and redesign the OR room, like, that's a huge task. Like, I think the effort of first targeting divestment is a low-hanging, feasible option for us to consider. And I mean, I think the hope is that as hospitals and healthcare as a whole adopts new values of greening healthcare and net zero vision, hopefully the foundations and the CFOs are going to start mirroring these values in their actions. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Richard. Very interesting. And next we are moving on to Laura McGrath. Laura McGrath is the Pension Engagement Manager at Shift. She works with networks of pension beneficiaries who want to understand and communicate to their pension funds the financial risks that climate change poses. Over the last 2 years, she has closely tracked the climate commitments and fossil fuel investments of the Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan and the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System, OMERS. She has supported working and retired nurses, pathologists, pharmacists, social workers, hospital efficiency experts, mental health professionals, municipal workers, and more to engage with their pension funds on the climate crisis. Before I finish this intro, I just want to remind everybody to put their questions in the chat. I do have a few questions, but I'd rather hear yours. And today, Laura will focus on pension plans. Laura.
Thanks, Miles, and everyone else who's spoken here. I'm joining from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and Wendat peoples. I'm probably going to refer a little bit to Ontario pensions. I know them best, but what I'm talking about is applicable to any pension. So if you're a member of the Canada Pension Plan, if you're working in Canada outside Quebec, it's applicable. If you're in Quebec, your pension would be managed by the CDPQ, Caisse de dépôt et placement de Quebec, so applicable there as well. I'm going to talk about why the climate crisis matters to pension funds and also why it is squarely in line with their fiduciary duty to account for climate risk. So just to think about what your pension is, you put money in, often your employer will put money in, it gets invested by a third party in all sorts of things, real estate, infrastructure, utilities, publicly traded companies, bonds. And the biggest, largest pension funds in Canada have $2 trillion in assets under management, more than $2 trillion. So it's equivalent to Canada's GDP. And to give an example, the Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan, HOOP, has around $104 billion. So as Adam said in his introduction, it's a huge chunk of capital that could be mobilized for reaching zero emissions. Pensions really need to consider the financial risks that the climate crisis poses, and there are a lot of risks. So this picture just kind of gives you a visceral sense that any pension fund that owns coastal assets, probably all of them, needs to be thinking about sea level rise, storm surges, hurricanes. But not just your coastal assets. Any asset a pension fund owns could be at risk from flooding or wildfire or extreme heat. And that's just looking at physical risk. So I'm going to talk about some of the other risks they are going to need to think about. So transition risk, what happens to your fossil fuel investments when electric vehicle sales overtake sales of internal combustion engine vehicles? Policy risk. So what happens to investments in gas utilities when jurisdictions start banning gas hookups in new buildings? This is happening in New York State. Also legal reputational liability risk. So what happens when oil and gas companies start being held accountable for climate damages? This is happening in California, where the state is suing the 5 biggest oil and gas companies to hold them accountable. And it's using the same playbook that the state of California successfully used against big tobacco in the 90s. So pensions need to be considering all of that, plus the big one, which is, oh, my slides are not advancing. The big one, which is that the climate crisis is a systemic risk, and their ability to generate returns depends on a stable climate. So kudos to the university pension plan, which says this publicly and repeatedly. Their ability to generate returns depends on a stable climate because they need a functioning economic system. So this is actually about paying out your pension and whether that's going to happen. And also it's about what your retirement is going to look like, because you probably want a stable climate in your retirement as well. Here at SHIFT, we don't just look at fossil fuel investments and exclusions. We did an analysis of the biggest public pension funds to determine their degree of climate alignment on a whole bunch of indicators. You could look at our report card to figure out where funds are on a bunch of different things, including investments and climate solutions. But we did look at fossil fuel exclusions. It's an interesting one because the burning of fossil fuels drives the climate crisis, and the climate crisis poses risks to everything else in a pension fund's portfolio. So it's worth looking at. And we found on the whole that Canadian pension funds lagged behind international leaders when it comes to fossil fuel exclusions. I want to point out that I think Colin mentioned this as well, but the International Energy Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are saying we need no investment in new fossil fuel supply in order to achieve the goal of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we have seen some movement on this. There are 5 Canadian public pension funds now that have placed at least some exclusion on some kinds of fossil fuels. But with the exception of Quebec's public pension manager, none of them have said that they will divest shares in publicly traded companies. The Quebec public pension manager has divested from coal mining and from oil. But this bit about publicly traded companies is interesting because financially it would have made sense. So this analysis, which has been done 2 years in a row by a Canadian group, shows that of all the pension funds they analyzed, the return would have been higher for their portfolio of publicly traded companies if oil and gas had been excluded 10 years ago. So we know pension funds are, they're starting to think about this. The fact that some of them have put any exclusions on it all shows that they're recognizing this is within the fiduciary duty. They're recognizing that the risks outweigh potential benefits. They're also hearing from their members. So here in Ontario, the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario had looked at some of SHIFT's materials. They decided to write a letter calling on their pension fund to divest its $1.6 billion in fossil fuel companies. I will put a link to their letter in the chat later on. It's really powerful, and I encourage you all to read it. We do often hear from funds that it's better to stay invested and use their influence as an investor or engage with companies to try to make change. So I just want to close off by pointing out that many investors have tried this for many years, and after a lengthy period of engagement have determined that fossil fuel companies are either unable or unwilling to align with a safe climate, which is why you see the pensions I've listed on this slide deciding to divest, saying that there is a significant misalignment between the long-term interests of a pension fund and staying invested in these companies. So at SHIFT, we work with different pension stakeholders so that they can engage with their funds on the climate crisis. We have seen some of the funds we track most closely two of them released climate plans this year, which is great to see. I'd be happy to chat more about that as we go to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Laura. And just an opportunity here to say thanks to both Adam and Laura and everyone else at SHIFT for all the amazing work they've been doing on this over the years. And we just need to shift this over to the healthcare sector and other forms. Laura, while you're on a roll here, first question from Helen Boyd. And I don't know if you completely cover this. Can Laura please tell us about the efforts of the Canadian Nurses Association and the Canadian Federation of Nurses Union to divest from fossil fuels?
I actually
Yeah.
don't know. So if someone on the call does know, would
Yeah.
love to hear from them.
Yeah, Laura, do you want to, I don't know if she's able to pop on or not. Is Laura able to join?
Do you mean Helen who asked the question?
Or, so I'm sorry, Laura. Helen, yes.
I can allow her to talk if she would like.
Yeah, I'm putting her on the spot here.
I can find her.
Let's see if she wants. Oh, here she is, Helen.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
I'm part of the Canadian Association of Nurses for the Environment in British Columbia. And I'm very interested in having seen that slide on the RNAO and their work, and would really be interested in doing similar work here in BC. But nationally, I was wondering, these are huge number members. Nurses are far more numerous than physicians, and wondered about the efforts or how SHIFT could at least assist us with advocating in this manner.
Yeah, Helen would be happy to talk further about that. We do have someone based in BC. Some of those associations that you mentioned are employers of the Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan as well. So we do have some information that would probably be useful for you. Happy to share that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right, I will jump into the first question here. Are there any resources that can help convince fund managers that divestment has a real impact on reducing emissions? So resources to convince the fund managers.
Yes, there are. I'd have to pull up some peer-reviewed studies that have come out in the last couple of years, but there have been several reviews of divestment activities having real-world impact on emissions and quantifying it quite clearly. So I'll have to dig those out, and maybe we can share them in a follow-up. But I know there was a big meta study that looked that up that just came out 2 years ago. So it is quite possible to show that impact, and I can sort of explain maybe quickly at a high level what it really looks like, to understand the mechanism behind it, which is in those studies, which is essentially companies, when they want to build projects, if you want to build a fossil fuel expansion project, I want to drill some oil wells, you need capital to do that. And most companies borrow or have investment directly to provide that capital. And the cost of that capital is variable. And so the divestment action, either from a lender or from an investor, has the effect across the market of increasing the cost of capital for certain activities. So if your fossil fuel divestment increases the cost of capital for anybody trying to drill a well, and it has the impact of actually blocking a lot of development. And that effect has been measured quite clearly, in addition to all of the other social license and political aspects that were discussed already on the call. There's a direct financial effect. And similarly, shifting investments into the solution side has the same effect of reducing the cost of capital for clean energy projects. So just wanted to explain that, and I'll look and find some resources we can share.
Okay, thank you. That sort of ties in with our next question. While many have a collective dislike for oil extraction companies, some companies do seem to be embracing solar and other alternative energy forms. So rather than simply cashing out common shares in oil companies and possibly suffering a significant loss due to the current state of the market, of course, the market's recently gone up, are there some oil companies that are better than others to retain in a portfolio?
That one as well. Very few oil and gas, we call it E&P, extraction production companies, are particularly good at renewable energy. There are very marginal portfolios of wind and solar projects that some oil and gas companies have created, but they typically go through a cycle of selling them off whenever they're trying to clear debt from their books. So it's actually a very spotty and poor track record across the sector. And there are essentially no pure play fossil fuel extraction companies, especially in the oil and gas sector, that have any sort of possibility of becoming clean energy companies. So the better pathway for them is to create separate companies that are pure play renewable companies. There's nothing stopping them from just saying, you know what, we're going to create, I don't know, Suncor Renewable, and create it as a side company that doesn't have the liabilities and the downside and the fossil fuels, and that would be investable. It wouldn't be screened out in a divestment. And that is where a lot of the companies have gone. So I think that's actually a much more likely model. And you're not if you want exposure to renewable energy, you can do that without investing in oil companies, which are overwhelmingly spending their capital on fossil fuel expansion.
I think Colin had a really great graph that illustrated the projections of these big fossil fuel producers, and it's quite surprising, isn't it? That it's sort of quite different from the messages we're hearing from the flashy posters and adverts on TV. It's maybe different. They've got some different messages going on from their business planning, from the what they project to the public.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to the next big topic, which is banks here. And I see Colin is going to answer this one. Colin, do you mind summarizing the question as well?
Yeah, so there's a two-parter about banks. One of them is basically it's the entanglement between RBC, a particular bank, but we can just say banks because many banks, not just RBC, are involved in financing fossil fuels and Canadian healthcare professional infrastructure. So not just like physical infrastructure like hospitals where like fixed capital is needed to pay for things, but also the infrastructure of our profession, that is the Royal College that certifies people as like a professional relationship to these banks. And I mean, I didn't want to take the answer and like take this question for myself. I think I'm really interested to hear what others have to say on this question, but I think that this is exactly the sort of like ecological thinking that I think is powerful about thinking about divestment. You start to see these linkages and the sort of problem in a holistic kind of way where your foundation says that you can't give up this particular bank or you'll lose a lot of donors. And it's like, well, why is it the case that we are dependent on the largesse of particular firms, which may be doing things privately that we disagree with, in order to run our healthcare, right? Like that's not necessarily a given about society. And I think that if we're to take IPCC seriously, that rapid, large scale, and unprecedented social transformation is necessary to avert the climate crisis, I think this is like precisely what they're talking about. You've got to untangle all of these things. And it may be the case that it's not possible for the RBC Foundation in this very moment to give up on RBC. Maybe there needs to be a lot of groundwork laid in order to like figure out how we pay for healthcare without RBC sponsoring it, or philanthropy providing a new operating room or hospital room where it's not going to be the priorities of healthcare workers and patients. It's sort of like, well, what are the priorities of these private firms? So I don't have a great answer to that, other than I think you have to think expansively about, other than that, they're right. They're right. We can't run the hospital without all the stuff that donors pay for, but also that's not the end of the sort of story here.
I'll just throw
Any other comments there?
I'll just throw something in quickly, which is corporate philanthropy is a two-way street. It's very easy to think of it as a one-way transaction where that corporation gives money and that's nice, but they get something out of it. They get a public profile, they get goodwill from the community. And so it's very possible to sit down with them and have a difficult conversation about how that isn't something that necessarily you're willing to give them if they continue to behave a certain way. It can be very challenging, but even having the conversation, not necessarily even dropping the sponsorship, can send a strong signal that this is something they need to change. And I think that's a critical piece. We see fossil fuel companies as well sponsoring all sorts of things that are completely counter to who they are as a company, with the desire to have that goodwill splash back onto the company. So I would think about it as a two-way transaction that you can participate in.
One other
I-
thing is that there's
Mhm.
the phrase reputational risk is worth thinking about here. If you're trying to convince someone who's unconvinced about, let's say your foundation, that like RBC poses a reputational risk, and you can point to any number of like splashy news stories about RBC's connections to anything from, Wet'suwet'en to, weapons sales and all this sort of stuff. So you can say that it's like Adam was saying, it's a two-way street. We're exposed to the things that RBC does. And you can sort of try to play up the sort of rising public discontent with RBC's action.
I think broadening it out from banks as donors to just donors as a whole, there's also like a good news story here as well. I think we're going to see in the coming years more and more public donors to healthcare asking for, yes, we want to invest in improved healthcare, maybe this new wing, maybe something else, but they're also going to want to look for co-benefits. They're going to want you to implement that healthcare spending in a climate-friendly way. And that will, sometimes the donors are going to drive change into the hospitals.
Look, well, we're still sort of on banks here. I'm going to jump ahead to Caroline's question here about green investing policy of major banks. I think we've touched on this a bit. And where would financial advisors be found to manage ESG investing? Does anyone want to add anything there? My understanding in terms of the second question would be to look at B corporations, for example, without mentioning any names. If you look up the B corporations in Canada, beneficial corporations, you might find an answer there. Anyone else?
I think some interesting things to look at. There's a lot in your question, Caroline. So some interesting things to look at in the green investing policy of major banks might be a report on where banks are on their climate commitments. So there's one from Investors for Paris Compliance recently did a report on the net zero commitments of banks you might want to take a look at. In terms of financial advisors who can manage ESG investing, no matter who your financial advisor is, they should be able to do this if enough people ask them to. And if they say they can't, then get a new advisor. But your financial advisor, they're managing your money, so you could ask them what to do with it.
And just an add-on to that is the term ESG is fairly meaningless in the sense of hard limits on what we're talking about, and sort of it tends to have sort of a best practice frame. So you'll see a lot of sort of vague gestures toward ESG in funds, and it's not particularly meaningful. But if you're really serious about this, a more serious way to ask your advisor is to think about what we call thematic investing. You can essentially say, I only want my investments to go to places that are climate positive, and to exclude certain sectors from. So if you say, I want a carbon-free fund, that's perhaps a better way to get at what you're looking for than sort of the generic green products, because I completely agree. There's a lot of greenwash, especially from the major banks, but across the financial system. And so you have to be incredibly precise about what it is exactly you want them to do. But as Laura says, they work for you. They do offer, many of the various fund managers do offer these products. You just have to ask.
All right. So one here about personal investments. I've been asking my financial advisor, which is in the management, to invest in fossil fuel funds for several years now, and we have done so. Nevertheless, several of the funds that in my portfolio are not fossil fuel free. My advisor is very hesitant to get out of these because they still make money. I understand the concern for my financial stability, but feel powerless in the context of many other docs who are investing and who are not pushing for fossil fuel free investments. I guess that ties into being part of MD management. This is not a question, just a comment, but I think, Laura, you spoke to that a bit a minute ago. And any other comments? I mean, I think, Laura, you're saying it's your money.
If we're treating this as a
Right.
problem of a relationship between yourself and your advisor and trying to convince them why this is a good idea for you to do, it sounds like you're having a sort of debate with them about things that make money. I mean, at some point, like, I think that if your advisor maybe have empirical data that conflicts with Adam's, and you can go down the rabbit hole of, you know, trying to appraise these econometric studies, I think that it is in favor of, you know, sort of fossil fuel divestment. But even if they're not, like, you can still always say that I'm not interested in funding these things. Like, you can just say, I don't want to be associated with these things, full stop. Like, that's a moral statement that has nothing to do with whether or not they make money, because you can invest in Raytheon and cigarettes if you want as well, because those make money.
All right, a question from Kent. Looks like for Richard. Richard mentioned, quote, screening out as a methodology. Is he or any presenter aware of any screening out checklist an individual investor could use to better screen their holdings?
I'm not aware of a checklist, but maybe other people that are more. Laura, Adam?
So two interesting things to look at would be the global coal exit list and the global oil and gas exit list. They're maintained by an NGO in Germany called Urgewald. They're updated yearly, and you can dive into the criteria by which coal, oil, and gas companies make their lists. But basically, it's expansion. So has this company committed to expanding new fossil fuel supply? If so, they're on the global coal exit list and the global oil and gas exit list.
And I think what I'd say is it's very easy to go down rabbit holes and to get overwhelmed with how to implement it. And in the end of the day, perfect is the enemy of good enough. You can find something that has a 70-80% reduction. So just take that. And checklists are always going to be maybe imperfect here, because it depends on your own values of risk and how much you want to trade off to make your portfolio even cleaner, possibly at the cost of diversification. But don't wait. It's easy to let years and years go by. We need to take action now, and perfect is the enemy of good enough.
We are getting close to the end, so I'm going to say a couple things. One, if you want to stay on, you can stay on to have your question answered. And Adam is nice enough to continue as the moderator. And I think a couple other people are staying on. Two of us have to jump off for another meeting, and you'll be glad to know it is about trying to shift hospital foundation money from fossil fuels, coincidentally. So I'll also throw out that if you are at a hospital that thinks you have a board member that might be interested in this, please have them reach out to the coalition. We'd love to engage with them. And so since I'm stepping off, thank you all. I thought that was excellent. And thank you, Adam, for taking the torch.
Great. Yeah, we keep taking a couple more questions. Just looking at the open ones in the chat. Trying to see where the top of the most recent ones are, because we've been through quite a few.
Adam, I can jump in. So someone asked me
someone
asked what's happening at CHIO. I mentioned our program. So CHIO has, over the last 4 years, made reducing our carbon footprint a strategic pillar of the hospital. So we have 6 strategic pillars, one of which is reducing our carbon. In the last 4 years, we've reduced our operational carbon footprint. So that's the facilities and emissions leaving the site, not the goods and services. So we've reduced that by 20% in those 4 years. So we're really proud of that. We've recently just been awarded $1 million by Environment Canada to invest in a deep energy retrofit. And obviously, as all these things are happening, divesting from fossil fuels is an action that we need to consider and pursue.
Yes, there's another comment on here about just noting that there could be fees or costs associated with exiting fossil fuels, specifically around load fees. I just wanted to flag that I think any expectation of an exit from fossil fuels from large investors in particular needs to have a bit of a timeline associated with it. So you can't say, tomorrow. Usually you have to sort of say a plan to phase out investments carefully. And I think it's important to recognize financial managers have an obligation to sort of not lose money intentionally. And there are strategies for exiting in ways that maximize return. So it doesn't have to be a tomorrow thing. It can be 6 months or a year. We've seen lots of thoughtful and careful exit strategies executed. So that's not really a concern if this is framed properly. Any other questions? I think we've gotten to most of the ones on the list here. Unless there's any final ones, we can wrap up. Any final comments anyone wanted to make before we close out the webinar? Autumn, would you like to close us out? You're on mute though. There we go.
I would be happy to. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all of our attendees today and everyone that registered for the webinar. As I said earlier, I'm going to be sending around that webinar recording. Kate also put into the chat our post-event survey. So for those of you still on, if you could take a look at that, that'd be great. I will also be sending it out in an email shortly. I want to say a big thank you to all of our presenters today, Richard, Adam, Colin, and Laura, and a big thanks to Miles as always for hosting as well. It's very interesting. I've already gotten lots of emails and feedback. So thank you all again.
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Bye, guys.